Back to my short story project. This half month's short story is Redheaded Baby by Langston Hughes. This month I read two short stories, one by Zora Neale Hurston and one by Langston Hughes. This is in part because it's Black History Month and in part because I like both those authors very much. Last year I read Their Eyes Were Watching God, and it's just a great book. And also last year I read a book of Langston Hughes' poetry, which I liked a lot. Langston Hughes may be the best known writer to come out of the time period that we call the Harlem Renaissance. He was a poet, he was a story writer, and he had a remarkable talent, I think, which allowed his career to last well beyond the time of the Harlem Renaissance. This story, Redheaded Baby, is fairly simple. In terms of its plot, in terms of its characters, but it carries some really deep ideas about race and racism in the United States of America. So just to summarize the plot, by the way, if you wanted to read this story and you realized my video is a day early and you wanted to read the story so you could kind of comment or think about the story as I make the video, you should stop right now and go ahead and read the story. I am putting this video up one day early. Anyway, the plot of Redheaded Baby is really simple. There is a man who works as, I think, a third mate, a deckhand, on cargo ships that sail up and down the east coast of the United States. He is an unhappy, unpleasant white man who doesn't even really like what he does. He doesn't like the cities and towns where he goes. And he is somewhere in a small coastal port town in Florida. And he is on his way to an African-American neighborhood to meet up with an African-American prostitute who he had sex with several years before. This is the first time he's been back, and his racism drips from every page. Everything he says, every attitude he has betrays his absolute racism towards African Americans. When he does find the house and he gets to the house, he finds the young woman with whom he had sex is there. She remembers him. The woman who is referred to as Auntie, who runs the house, remembers him. And I'm not sure if this aunt or auntie is really the young lady's aunt, or if she's just that's the name they use for a madam, because clearly this young woman is a prostitute, which the character Clarence, the main character Clarence, reminds us of all quite frequently. When he gets there, he sees her. She's pretty much the same as she's been, but then he is incredibly disturbed to find that she has a child, a son, who is named Clarence, who is very light-complected and who has red hair, much as Clarence does. This causes him a great deal of unhappiness, and he leaves the home after paying Auntie $2 for the alcohol he's drunk. So this is, like I said, a pretty straightforward story, but it contains so much, I think, about the history of race relations in the United States that goes all the way back to the days of slavery. These are topics I've talked about on my channel before, that essentially one of the themes of the story and one of the underlying currents in the story is the frequency with which white racist men have sexual relations with African American women. We know now, and it's hopefully a well-covered topic now, that these kinds of rapes, because in the days of slavery, enslaved women could not give consent, that these rapes happened with far more frequency than people like to believe before about 20 or 30 years ago. Okay, sorry about that. Lighting a little different, hair a little messier, food in my beard. My battery ran out on my camera, so I went to eat dinner. And now I'm back to finish. So what I was talking about was the kind of history of white men during the slave era raping slaves, and that resulting in children being born. And then the owners of these enslaved women and their children then would decide what to do with those kids, whether to accept them, whether to treat them as children, whether to keep them on their plantations or farms, whether to sell them away. That those decisions were completely up to the owner. And in the same way, Clarence, in this story, has the same power to decide the fate of his son. Clearly, he is the father of this child. and therefore he has the right to decide what happens to the child. Will he accept the child? Will he, marry the woman, as unlikely as that seems like it would be? Or will he reject that child? Well, in the story, he rejects that child, and he leaves as quickly as he possibly can, even though he must realize that Betsy's child is in fact his child. And in a sense, Betsy is as much enslaved in the sense of being a prostitute as enslaved women were, and that she doesn't have any choices about who she sleeps with either, and therefore Clarence is just playing out this role again. Throughout the story, Clarence refers to Betsy as being yellow. This, of course, was a term used to describe light-skinned African Americans, and we learn from Auntie in this story that Betsy's father was himself a white man, and thus, Hughes builds in here the story of this happening over and over again, and thus, hearkening back or referencing the history of this kind of thing in the American South during the days of slavery, and again, Betsy's prostitution being a form of slavery here herself, in which she has no choice. So it's a really disturbing story. I think the most disturbing aspect of it is, in some way, Clarence's reaction to his own child. As a father, I find it hard to believe that anybody witnessing their own child, no matter what the circumstance, would react as Clarence does. He is repulsed. He is disgusted. He doesn't want the kid coming anywhere near him. He describes the kid in the most grotesque terms as being like the kind of a doll at a carnival that's a part of a game that you whack with a stick or that you shoot with a gun. In other words, he's essentially describing his own son, who has red hair and even lighter colored skin. He's describing him as a freak, and that clearly he sees him as a freak, which, of course, unfortunately, American society at the time which Langston Hughes wrote the story would have also seen these children as freaks, as outcasts, and they probably wouldn't have been comfortable in either, or wouldn't have been fully accepted in white society, certainly, but maybe not even in African American society. It is a really powerful story, a really disturbing story. It's not one, when you get to the end of it, you feel anything but bad, anything but, in a sense, dirty, that this situation is in fact horrible, but that's part of the power of Hughes's writing and part of the power of the story. Anyway, if you read Redheaded Baby, please let me know in the comment section down below. If you had any other thoughts or anything else you'd like to add to my video, please do that in the video down below. Even if you haven't read the story, I'd be interested in hearing what you think. And as always, thank you for watching.